Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar on approaching property management for charities post-COVID. My name's Andrew Small. I'm a partner in the charity and social business team at Russell Cooke. My colleague, Catherine Flexer, who's an associate solicitor who works with me, is also going to be participating in the seminar. We're very pleased to be partnering with this with our friends at the Ethical Property Foundation, and Simon Taylor, who is a senior property advisor at the foundation, will also be participating. The webinar, as I think you said, the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available afterwards. There is a Q&A function in the program, so if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A function. Unless it's absolutely screamingly urgent, we're not proposing to sort of answer the questions during the event, but we will have time for Q&A afterwards, and we will work through such questions have come in and respond to them as best we can. So to hand over now to Simon, who will briefly introduce EPF and then go into the first element of the webinar, which is about some of the practical building management issues that he's seeing charities grappling with as the return to the office, the return to the office begins. Simon.
Right, good morning, everyone. My name is Simon Taylor. I'm a senior property advisor at the Ethical Property Foundation. As my CEO would say, we're small but beautifully formed. I think that used to be an advert. We provide a certain amount of free online charity advice via, he's not a bot, but he acts like a bot. So if you do have individual queries, go onto our website and you can make some free property inquiries. It is limited, I'm afraid, because that is driven by the funding that we have. If it is of a more serious or more substantial inquiry, then I head up the affordable property consultancy. So at what we believe are substantially below commercial market rates, we provide commercial advice to charities on their property issues. So it's guidance. I would see us as a critical friend, and we have carried out, which is where I'm about to launch into, probably now 50-55 property assessments for charities on their property, how to use it pre-COVID, during COVID, and now post-COVID. So if we could have the next slide, please, Catherine. So setting the scene. So I think the first thing we need to do is to stand back and just look at your premises. Look at your stakeholders, look at your clients, and look at what has happened. It's been a very, very difficult period for charities. Some have not been back to the property other than going in once a week, literally to collect post. Some have had 2 days in, that's one team, 3 days in the next team. Some have just had core people in there. Now I think is the time to sit down and decide, is your property fit for purpose? What do you want to do about it? The first issue we would say is you need to know what you have. So do you own it freehold? Do you have a lease? Do you have a license? What is it? How is it held? And what have you been doing during COVID? So did you liaise with your landlord? Have you just been paying the rent all the way through? Did your landlord issue any sort of waiver, any sort of reduction? Did you document it? The other thing I think you need to think about is how much did it cost to run your building whilst you were hardly in it or hardly using it at all? Did you spend any money on it? All these are questions which are now affecting the running costs of the buildings that people occupy. Moving forward, the other things that people need to think about are minimum energy efficiency standards. So moving forward, the government is looking for buildings to be more efficiently run. So if you rent a property from a landlord, they will, at a point in time, have to start looking at this. If you are renting your part of your space out to other charities, you will also need to look at this, as this will be coming forward as more and more of a condition. Health and safety refresh. Many charities will have had standard health and safety assessment, which probably is somewhere, hopefully in a piece of paper, hopefully put up somewhere so when people walk in, your stakeholders or your staff, they know what it is. But with COVID, you need to think about whether that is appropriate. Does it need updating? Now, some of this is appropriate moving forward. Hopefully, if you weren't occupying the property, you remember to tell your insurer. If you didn't, even if you're going to change how you occupy it, you need to notify your insurer. And every time you do something which relates to your property, whether it's dealing with the landlord, whether it's health and safety, whether it's insurance, please write it down. Please make a note of it. And please keep details of what you do with the property. Because sadly, as landlords start to push for more rent, or if you're thinking of leaving, what you did in the last 18 months will be incredibly critical. So, Catherine, we can move to the next slide. So, practical measures as a result of making your property more, in inverted commas, COVID friendly. So, hopefully you've agreed some internal and external configuration of the premises. You've put together your health and safety assessment. You've worked out whether it's appropriate in terms of travel distances. You've checked all your electrical appliances, your lifts, your air extraction systems. One of the big issues is buildings that have not been used for some time. There are potential issues with things like Legionnaires. There's potential issues with are the utilities fit for purpose? So you may well need to get a professional in to get these tested if you've not been using them properly. So hopefully you reviewed your entrance both physically and procedurally. You've hopefully worked out some alternative routes. You've hopefully worked out visitor numbers. Ventilation in particular is really, really important. Although cleaning regimes are something that people spend a lot of time on, it's become more and more apparent that actually one of the big issues is the aerosol effect of the vaccine. So make sure that your building is well ventilated, make sure that windows have been open, and make sure that the rooms that you use for your staff and for people coming in are well ventilated. So, internal rooms with no ventilation, having a fan blowing around, potential COVID virus particles is not a good plan. We've had a number of charities who've now come to us and said, we are going to totally reuse the building. So what they're now looking at is the layout of desks, work areas, benches, internal routeways. It doesn't have to be expensive. A lot of it is all about clutter, I'm afraid. Sadly, a lot of charities overuse their space. We went into one building where the desks were surrounded by files 6 feet high. It wasn't good working conditions. It wasn't safe for the staff, and certainly it made cleaning of the building really, really difficult. If you've not been into the building or part of the building for a while, it makes sense to have a deep clean. So there are people out there who are specializing in a deep clean. So it's worth getting these people in, clearing the clutter, and actually going back to what we call an open desk policy. More and more, you're going to have people coming in to use your facilities. The old hot desk of someone else's desk with a whole lot of detritus all over the desk just isn't acceptable anymore. So as a charity, you are responsible for your visitors, your stakeholders, your staff. Ultimately, your trustees are responsible for giving you an environment that it is safe to work in. So I think people need to take a step back and seriously think as to how they use their building. One of the ways can be, as we touched on earlier, is you agree core days and core hours with different teams. That's also worth thinking about if you have concerns over a potential COVID outbreak, because if you've got separate teams, then if one team goes down, you've still got the second team who come in. If everyone's coming in and mixing with each other and it's COVID and there are pings, then you lose your whole team. PPE was a big issue. It's less of an issue now, but we would still suggest that you make sure that you have additional masks on reception for people to come in, the hand sanitizers. Just make sure your building is fit for purpose. Catherine, I think we're moving on now to your bit, which is, so what are you going to do with the property now? Are you going to stay in it? Are you going to leave? Are you going to move? What are you going to do? And Catherine's going to talk through some of the issues here. And I'll remember to turn my mic off.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, so is your property an asset or a liability? A property can quickly go from being one of your greatest assets to one of your greatest liabilities if it's become surplus to your requirements or too expensive for you to operate. So this slide looks at ways that you might dispose of surplus space, and it focuses on leasehold space. If you do have freehold space that you no longer use, then in general it's going to be more straightforward to market and sell that. So exercising a break clause, if you're lucky enough to have a break clause within your lease, then generally that's going to be the most straightforward option for you to end the lease early. Now, obviously, that will depend on when the break date falls. If you've got a very flexible break clause that just says you can give a month's notice at any time, then that's brilliant. But many leases will say that you have to give notice either to leave on a certain day or on or after a certain day. And once you've established that you've got a break clause and that you can use it, you need to look really carefully at the conditions and the requirements. The first requirement will be the notice requirement, making sure that you do give sufficient notice, and then checking whether there are any other conditions that would apply even after you've served that notice. So, for instance, some leases will say, even if you've served a break notice, if you haven't paid the rent up to date by the break date, then that notice will be of no effect and the lease will continue. So it's really important to check that you've complied completely with the conditions in order to make sure that the break clause works. If you don't have a break clause, then one possibility for ending the lease early could be to negotiate a surrender, which basically means that the lease comes to an end early. But this will be completely at the landlord's discretion as to whether they want to agree to it. Often landlords will want to charge a premium or something to compensate them for the loss that they're going to suffer by not having you in there for the remainder of the lease term. And that could be particularly the case at the moment where they're going to be concerned that they might struggle to find a new tenant, or they might think that a new tenant might not want to pay the same level of rent. So always worth having the conversation, but not always possible to strike a good deal. Selling or assigning your interest in the property. So for leasehold, that would basically be where you assign the lease, so a new tenant steps into your shoes and takes over all the lease obligations. Again, at the moment, question as to whether you're likely to be able to find somebody who wants to do that. The new tenant would take on the lease on exactly the same terms, so the same level of rent. And it might be that any new tenants, particularly of office space, are looking to pay a smaller rent at the moment. So that could be a challenge, but if you can find someone, it's certainly a possibility. Another option that can be quite useful, especially if you only want to get rid of or share a part of your space, is to sublet or grant a license to occupy. This could be useful, for example, if you've got a whole building and you only want to use a couple of floors from now on and you want to let out the remaining floors. Both assignment and underletting will generally need the landlord's consent. So again, just bearing in mind, checking that the lease, what the lease says on that, and liaising with the landlord if you think it could be a good option for you. Pros and cons of each option. If you have a break clause, it's generally going to be the most straightforward option. There are some cons of all of the other options. For example, if you are subletting, you're not ending the lease. You're still on the hook as the direct tenant of the landlord, and so potentially if that sublease, if that subtenant did stop paying the rent, then you're going to still remain on the hook for that rent. And a similar position can be the case with assignment, because often a lease will say that if you assign your lease, you have to act as guarantor for that new tenant. So again, if they fail to pay the rent, then you're in the same position that you were in anyway. Moving on to other options for if you're struggling to pay your rent, but for various reasons you either can't or don't want to end the lease. The government's recently extended the protection from forfeiture for commercial tenants to March 2022, which essentially means that if you're a commercial tenant and you have fallen behind on your rent payments during the pandemic, then your lease can't be brought to an end early on that basis alone. The same hasn't been extended for residential tenants. So that gives you some level of protection in that you know that on that basis alone, your landlord can't at the moment end your lease early, but it doesn't mean that your liability to pay rent falls away. And at some point, this suspension of the legal remedies for landlords is going to end, and at that point I think there are going to be a lot of landlord forfeiture claims. But if you are struggling to pay the rent, then I'd suggest always negotiating with your landlord. We've seen lots of deals being done recently. Generally, a landlord's going to prefer to have a tenant in the building, even if they've had to agree a bit of a rent reduction, than not have one in there at all. And if you're saying, look, we can't pay this level of rent anymore, but the landlord thinks, well, actually, you're a good tenant and we'd struggle to find someone else who would pay that level of rent at the moment, then it could be that they'll agree to some kind of reduction or deferral. Whatever is agreed, it's important to get it in writing. You could think that something's, deal's been done informally, but it's unlikely to have legal effect unless something's actually been put in writing and signed and documented properly. A quick note on if you're entering into a new agreement, say if you're staying in your same premises but you're renewing your lease, for instance, it's becoming more common. We're certainly seeing it for tenants to ask for pandemic-related rent suspension clauses, which would basically mean that in the event that there's a lockdown or you're unable to use your property due to government guidance, your rent would either be suspended for that period or reduced. There are various iterations of these types of clauses that we're seeing at the moment, and there's not really one standard clause because it would depend on the type of property and how you're likely to be affected by any further lockdowns, but that's certainly something worth considering. And finally, just a point that there are clearly some charities who are landlords themselves and are really struggling where they've got tenants who can't pay the rent and they're not able to forfeit their leases at the moment. And really, it's quite a difficult position to be in. There are other remedies that are still open to you, one of which would be to sue for the debt. But that's only really going to be worth the cost if you believe that the tenant does have the money to pay you. So again, it's probably worth negotiating and seeing if a deal can be done. And again, anything that is agreed, put in writing. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, who's going to talk about potentially moving premises.
Thanks, Catherine. Just to reassure you, I've just noticed that there isn't a secret missing slide 3, because I noticed we've gone from slide 2 to slide 2 to number slide 4 there. There was just a bit of a formatting error rather than a missing slide. So I am just going to talk about coming out of the sort of assessment of property and what your needs what your needs are. If you have decided to move, just some of the issues to think about, and some of the issues that are likely to come up. Some of it is sort of new thinking, sort of COVID related stuff, but some of it is, there are sort of issues that have always come up with office moves and always will. So just to sort of rehearse some of those again in the context of the sort of slightly new, the new world that we the newish world that we find ourselves in. So it starts really from the strategic decision. We've assessed our existing premises. We've assessed what our likely business model is going to be going forward, and we've decided we need to move, or we need new or different premises. So what do we need? It was quite interesting just this morning. A colleague was saying at our weekly team meeting that one of our clients, who we know served a break notice on a lease, and has now moved out. Their feedback was, we're all working from home remotely at the moment. It's all great at the moment, but I suspect that in a few months the board are going to decide that we need new premises. So we will probably be going back out into the market. And again, it is something we've seen at the moment that. Because everyone had got used to working from home, where our clients have been doing transactions, the back-to-back element of making sure you can getting out of the old building and getting into the new one without any gap or over a weekend, it's something that people have got a bit more phlegmatic about, because they know that everyone can work flexibly. Everyone can work flexibly for at least a period. One of the trends in the market that it's come a little bit in and out of fashion over the years, but now seems to be coming back in, is charity co-location, or charities sharing space with each other. So one of the decisions will be is, do we want to be sharing occupation with others as part of the new space to make it a bit more flexible, to try and reduce the costs, or do we want the more traditional ownership model of whether it's freehold or leasehold? We want our own space, we want our own premises. If you're thinking about co-location or sort of flexible use of space, there are a couple of sort of sector-specific options. The ethical property company is out there and has buildings in various cities of the country where charities and social enterprises can occupy on reasonably flexible terms. There's some of you may be aware of Can Mezzanine, which is a charity itself set up to improve the administration and management of the charity sector, and they offer flexible office space specifically aimed at charities. But we're increasingly seeing charities thinking about using surplus space and trying to sort of defray costs going forward by offering space to other organisations to occupy on different, on varying bases and different flexibilities. Whatever space you end up deciding to buy or rent or move into is very important. However friendly your relationship with the landlord or the other charity you want to be working with, there is always going to be a degree of due diligence that needs to be done, although that should be proportionate to the commitment that you're taking on. In terms of the legal due diligence, you need to be clear that the document you're entering it into, whether it's called a lease, whether it's called a license, whatever it is, that it accurately reflects the commercial deal that you've struck, that it gives you certainty that you're going to be able to occupy the space. It gives you at least clarity on what you're going to be paying, and I'll come on to that a bit more in a moment. And it's clear that you can use the premises for what you want to be. You use the premises for your permitted purposes. If you're going to have stakeholders, clients visiting you, to a significant degree, if the permitted use is just for office use, is that enough? Do you need a bit more flexibility? Do you need a bit more flexibility on the user clause? There's also going to be an element of technical due diligence, which will interact with the legal one, and this is this is getting input from surveyors of varying specialisms potentially on whether the premises are going to be fit for purpose. And if you're taking a floor in a multi-let building now, particularly given the sensitivities around COVID, it's important to think about not just the premises you're going to be occupying, but also going to be the common parts, because Simon was talking about the procedures and things that you need to have in place to make sure that your premises, your space is as safe as possible. But if the landlord's not live to the point and the common parts don't have hand sanitizer, don't have good ventilation, have pinch points where people are going to be coming together in large numbers for potentially sustained periods of time, then that's then that's a concern that you need to think about what the way of getting it addressed is. So clearly, a key but not the sole element of any deal is going to be the financial outgoings. What are you paying? And it's important to note that the headline rent is only one element of that. VAT, real sensitivity for many charities. I've had it drummed into me over the years by a number of charity finance directors when I blithely say to them the rent is £10,000 a year plus VAT. They say to me, no, it isn't. For us, it's £12,000. For us, it's £12,000 a year because we can't recover our VAT. So VAT is an important thing to be aware of in that regard. If you're taking space in a multi-let building, then there will be service charge, most likely be service charge to pay as well, the contribution towards the landlord's costs for repairs and maintenance and insurance as well. It is a real can be a real financial risk point, because suddenly you could find that the landlord wants or needs to do major works to the building. There isn't a sinking fund that they can draw on, and so they hit you with a very large service charge demand. And service charge has come up 2 or 3 times in recent years for clients who've just moved into newly built premises as well. So I think one of the things I've taken away from the last few clients I put into new space is that the landlord's initial service charge budget is a real finger in the air job, and for year 2, when the landlord suddenly finds out what the building actually cost to run rather than what they thought it would cost to run, that's another risk point for getting sort of big increases in service charge. You may be able to agree a cap on the service charge to at least give you some certainty and protection on that. And that's a good example of where the legal and technical elements of the due diligence need to come together. So you look at what the lease says about how much service charge you might be paying, and a surveyor looks at the building and what works it might need done to it, and then you come together and work out what the right commercial position to take is in terms of, are we prepared to take a bit of a view on service charge, or is there a risk point there? Do we need a service charge cap? Business rates, another sort of important outlay to think about. Clearly, charities still at the moment get 80% mandatory rates relief. It's always threatened that that's going to be clawed back or reduced when business rates reform happens, but that dog hasn't barked yet. But it's something that the sector is going to need to keep under review. It's also important to make sure that you're using the space in a way that properly allows you to claim business rates. I've got a client at the moment who did have a premises that they were providing some direct charitable activity from, but also had let it out for commercial purposes to raise money. They had a good relationship with the council. The council were giving them their 80% business rates, but it was highly doubtful it was highly doubtful even then whether they were actually using the premises wholly or mainly for charitable purposes, which means more than 50%. So there was some question of whether they should have been getting their charity rates relief, but they're now restructuring their operations so that they cease the direct provision of charitable activities from that building, which will clearly bring them outside the scope of charity rates relief. So we're just grappling with that at the moment with input from a rating surveyor as to how to get the position on a legally correct one going forward, how to defray the costs as best as possible, and if we do approach the ratings people to say that we're no longer eligible for relief, trying to make sure that they don't look back at the position and try and claim that we weren't eligible for relief historically anyway. So what can go wrong with what can go wrong in an office move? Many and varied things, but I thought I would just flag sort of 2 or 3 issues that have come up for me on recent office transactions as the sorts of things that can go wrong a bit unexpectedly and need to be kept an eye on. As Catherine would probably testify, I've become a bit of a telecoms bore in recent months because I've had 3 or 4 office moves where the thing that's held up the move held up the ability to actually use the space is telecoms, in terms of getting agreements between landlord, tenant and data provider to put new cabling in the building and switch it on. And certainly the last couple of those that I've had, it's been a really frustrating one because the point of view of the charity tenant, there's very little you can do to influence the process. You have your agreement with your data provider, they want to put the fibre in, but it's about the legal documentation of that can be tricky because a lot of institutional landlords have their own bespoke form of way-leave agreement, which can run to sort of 10, 20 pages, putting all sorts of obligations on the tenant and all sorts of obligations on the telecoms provider. But the telecoms provider had its own form, a lot shorter, a lot less obligations on them. And as the tenant solicitor, you feel like you're the sort of umpire in a tennis match as it goes back and forth between the landlord and the telecoms provider, and you've got very little scope to influence the situation. But it's your client who's really suffering. So, what I would say, if you are planning a new move, is get real clarity at an early stage on what the telecoms position is in the building, and if you're going to need to put new fibre in, make new connections, get a clear understanding of your telecoms provider's requirements, get a clear understanding of the landlord's requirements, and get the two of them talking to each other as quickly as possible. It can be a real issue. Simon touched on the importance of ventilation in terms of thinking about your building as you move back into it. And also, if you are moving into a new building, may well be important and necessary to take specialist advice as you're planning the configuration of your new space, to make sure that the ventilation solutions are right, to make sure that there's quite a lot of guidance published by the Health and Safety Executive now on ventilation in buildings, and that you need to work a ventilation solution into your fit-out plans. Again, had a client recently who had some advice on a ventilation solution for their new space because there were going to be some internal meeting rooms that didn't have windows, so they were going to need an air extraction solution, and the engineers came up with a technical solution. We took it to the landlord, but because it involved putting a hole in the outside structural wall of the building so that the air handling equipment had an exit point, the landlord wasn't prepared to agree that, so the engineers quite literally had to go back to the drawing board, come up with a different solution which was more expensive and more tricky to implement, but we eventually did find a way through it, which again is another good example of the sort of legal and technical elements of the office move needing to sort of march together. And the importance of having a professional team and not viewing the lawyer, the surveyor, the project manager in isolation. If you can put together a team that knows each other and works well together, you can identify issues such as that. And deal with them in a more sort of prompt and timely way. And the other thing another just issue I would flag that's currently on my desk is the time between tenant A leaving and tenant B going in, because generally there's a bit of time, but I've got a couple of projects at the moment where there's going to be a very short gap between tenant 1 going out and tenant 2 going in, and what we're having to be live to there is the repairing issues. And just to make it clear that for our client who's going into these premises, before there's time to repaint and do all the sort of dilapidations related work that usually happens, that we are not sort of stuck on the face of it with responsibility for remedying disrepair that's actually the responsibility of the previous tenant. As I'm sure is coming out, there is a lot to think about, both in an office move and also once you're in new premises, particularly post-COVID. Estates management and building management is going to be, it's going to be increasingly important for the charity to show that it has allocated sufficient capacity and expertise to the job. So both for doing an office move and a transaction, and also for being a building owner or just having a lease of a space, it's really important that you don't just think about the office move and then, it's just a building and it'll run itself. It won't. It's really important that you've got capacity in the organisation to identify issues as they arrive and to deal with them. So Catherine, thank you. You just moving on to the the last of the main slides, is now the time to invest in property. Again, it's something that's come in and out of, having worked in the sort of charity property sector for sort of 20 years now. Themes come in and out of fashion and things become popular and less popular. And, one of the strategic debates that charities have is, we have capital available. Is property the right place? Is property the right place to use it? There are likely to be opportunities to buy at the moment, and I'll ask Simon just to come in a minute to talk about that. But it really comes out again of a strategic decision about where do you want to be, what sort of property do you want, and how much flexibility do you want? Because it may be the right thing to do to invest if the charity has funds available, or if you've got an income stream that that could service a mortgage rather than paying rent. It may be right to invest in a capital asset by buying freehold property and become a building owner and manager, but it's not a risk. It's not a risk-free course of action, and it's important that the strategic decision is right, and that you have got the capacity in the organisation to be a building owner if you are going to go down that route. Clearly, if we're buying freehold property, due diligence again is absolutely key to make sure you know what you're buying, to make sure that your property is going to be an asset or a liability. And it's important, to give yourself enough time, whether it's a leasehold or a freehold transaction. We're certainly finding, I think, that deals take a bit longer to get over the line these days than they perhaps did 2 or 3 years ago. And, if you're coming to a point where you're refinancing existing mortgage, or if you are coming to the end of a lease, it's really important to start that strategic decision several months before the end date, to make sure that you know what you want to do, to know how you want to be owning and using property going forward, and you make sure you've got enough time to implement that decision. Simon, did you just want to say a few things about sort of the market and what whether there are opportunities out there at the moment, and just the things about sort of risks of sort of building out the sort of particular issues for freehold ownership?
Right. Okay. Thank you, Andrew. I mean, that was really interesting. What I would always say is please, please, please engage a commercial solicitor when you're dealing with property. One of the issues we find is someone has taken advice from a solicitor, and there are lots of solicitors. Sadly, some of them have experience not in the charity sector and not in the commercial sector. So at the Ethical Property Foundation, we quite often find situations where something's being done because someone had a look at it and said it was okay. And then we say, but who said it was okay? Oh, well, we didn't pay any money for it and it was a friend, or it was done at a reduced rate. So all I would say is selling the services of Andrew or Catherine is always, always go to a good commercial solicitor with charity experience. So in terms of buying property, leasing a property, taking a property on, so a property costs money. It costs money to repair, it costs money for rates. A property is an expensive item. So the first thing, I think, even before you rent, buy, acquire any property, please be aware that someone in the organisation needs to be responsible for it, because having no one responsible is unfair on the charity, and ultimately it will reflect and cost you money. So you need to know that you have the capacity, either by taking external professional advice or within the organisation, to rent or buy property. I think the next big issue, fork in the road, for want of a better word, is, as Andrew has touched on, a number of charities either by default, well, we don't need the building as big anymore, or actually we have some money which we want to invest. Why can't we rent part of it out? It's complicated. It's complicated in that you are a landlord, so you have to supply that charity that presumably you're renting to with high quality services. There is going to be competition in the sector, I believe, for space. So is your building green? Is your building efficient? Is your building really, really COVID compliant? Has it got good secondary access? Has it got good ventilation, as Andrew was saying? There are a number of properties out there. We've all seen the decimation of the high street. So perhaps there's an opportunity to buy a cheap building, maybe an ex-shop, maybe an office, but maybe it hasn't got car parking. So maybe that's the way it's cheap. But I think you also need to think of the cost benefit. So could you take that lump of money that you're thinking of spending, it could be all cash or it could be cash and a mortgage. Should you, and we're talking to a charity at the moment about this, the cost benefit is, should you invest the money elsewhere, maybe through a charity property fund, if you want to invest in property, maybe through a property equities and gilts fund. That would give you an income that would then allow you to rent a property. Because going forward, I don't think anyone knows what's going to happen in 3 or 5 years' time. And buying property is a long-term game. It's expensive to get in and it's expensive to get out. So we're not saying don't buy property. I think the first thing is, sit down and decide, do you buy a property? Do you rent a property? Do you license a property? Do you actually need a property? Assuming you've made that decision, the next decision is, do you, big risk, take a building bigger than you want? Question, because you think you could let it out in the market. Is it fit for purpose? Is it best in class? And do you have the expertise or the experience to run it? Is it taking away from your charity's main idea, thoughts, process? Assuming that you do want to take it on board, think about flexibility. Are people going to want property in 3 to 5 years' time? Probably. Are they going to want property where you are buying? That's a really, really tricky question. So potentially look at it as an asset that you might need to either dispose of, sell, or move on. Maybe there's something clever you could do with it. There's a question in the chat box we might touch on later, where a charity owns a property, they would like to dispose of it, it's being used for charitable purposes. However, it has extra higher value if it was converted into flats or other use. So potentially your charity asset that you use for charity purposes could be an investment, but it could also be a big cost. And so we would always say, take good professional advice and make sure there are people within the organisation, not that it's defaulted to the chairman or to the chief executive or to the finance person because no one wants to pick it up, or it's only picked up because the bills come in. You need to have either internal property experience, or it will be a cost, pay for external property advice on a regular basis. Sorry, Andrew, I went on a bit, but I do worry that charities think just buying a property, oh, we don't have to pay rent. That saves us money. And also sharing occupation, which I know is one of your bêtemnoires, is, you know, you might think you know the other charity really, really well, but working and sharing space with them suddenly proves that maybe it's not quite as easy as you thought it might be. Maybe you want to touch on that, Andrew.
Yes, as I say, the colocation issue. I mean, there's two manifestations of that. There's what I've sort of christened over the years the dictatorship model, which is someone like the Ethical Property Company or Can Mezzanine. They own a building, they are in control, they set the rules, and charities can go and work there and be based from there and operate from there. And from a bill, and that's to be contrasted with sort of the democracy model, where sort of a group of charities, generally with related objects, will come together saying we want to buy a building as our shared and joint home. And I've only ever seen a couple of those actually come to fruition, and again they didn't last more than a few years, because I think the challenges of building ownership became such it ended up as the point where the property was sold. And to be fair, I think a significant capital gain was made by the co-owners, but they ended up going there they ended up slightly going their separate ways again. So it can be done, but what I would say is, if you're thinking about a sort of co-ownership or a co-location approach to property ownership and management going forward, there's got to be an absolute burning strategic imperative to do it and a desire to do it, because there are so many challenges and so many problems that can trip you up. It's easy to spend a lot of time and effort and money on planning a scheme like that, and then it ultimately doesn't come to fruition because one of the partners decides they don't want to do it. So anyway, thanks, Simon. That is the conclusion of the formal part of the webinar, but we're just going to move on to the Q&A in a moment. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening.